Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the UC Denver Business School. On behalf of the Global Energy Management Program, thank you for coming today. My name is Chris Hansen, and I have the pleasure of serving as the interim faculty chair for the program. And one of my fun duties is to get to introduce our speakers today as part of our speaker series. I see some current students, some alums, lots of great folks from across Denver joining us today, and we've got 20 or so people by streaming video as well. So we'll blast it out to the world and share our series remotely as well. So today we're pleased to have two speakers to present. We're going to be taking a close look at tracking energy security risks and some of the research that both Stephen and Daniel have been working on. Let me first just do a couple of quick introductions. Our plan is to then let them run through some of their remarks and prepared material, and we should have plenty of time for Q&A as we get toward the 1 o'clock mark. First, Steve Eule is currently the Vice President for Climate and Technology at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Energy Institute. And he has more than 2 decades experience working in energy policy and different roles within, I guess, the inside the Beltway, if I may use that phrase. Previously worked on President Bush's climate initiatives, represented the United States at the IPCC and the different UN meetings that happened during the 2000s. Before that was on staff, the House Science Committee, and worked as legislative director for Representative Nick Smith from Michigan. Also worked for Governor Todd in her DC office back when she was governor of New Jersey. Stephen holds a undergraduate degree from Southern Connecticut State College and a graduate degree in geography from George Washington University in DC. Also have Daniel Klein with us, who is the president of 21st Century Strategies, brings decades of experience in energy, environmental, and economic analysis, was previously senior vice president at ICF Resources, one of the venerable consulting firms with big presence in DC, among other places. Know them from my time at IHS, one of our competitors at times. So in 1995, he left ICF and founded 21st Century Strategies and has been focused on this type of work that we're going to see today for many decades. He has an undergraduate degree from MIT and holds an MBA from Stanford's Graduate School of Business. Please help me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So Dan and I have just started to do this. Well, our first presentation was yesterday, so we're still kind of new at this, and we're trying not to step on each other. But let me explain to you a little bit about the Global Energy Institute. We're a quasi-independent group within the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We've been in business now for about 11 years, and our membership comprises all the large energy producers. We have utilities, we have coal, oil, gas, renewables. We also have large energy consuming members as well. And really our purpose, in Washington, they have a lot of trade associations that focus on specific fuels or specific sectors. What's unique about the Global Energy Institute is that we represent all the sectors and try to give a broader business perspective on energy and energy policy issues before the federal government and increasingly in the states as well. So that's a little bit about who we are. So how did we start this Energy Security Risk Index? Well, being in Washington, what people in Washington do a lot is they develop policy prescriptions, right? And that's what we were doing in 2008. And we were about to release a document giving our policy recommendations to the new administration. And we got to thinking, one of the claims we were making in our document was, if you follow these policies, it's going to help your energy security. And we started asking ourselves, well, how do we know that? And that got us to thinking. We brought Dan in for some analytical help, and that got us started thinking about an energy security index of some sort. And we both thought that somebody must have thought of this. And we did a lot of research, and we found that nobody had done energy security index of any kind. So we said, well, if nobody else had done it, maybe we should do it. And so we did. And that's the genesis of this project. We thought it would take about 3 months. It actually took about 1.5 years. I'm not going to say we got everything right here, but I think we got a lot right. And we come at this from 3 perspectives. The first perspective is, how is our energy security doing compared to where it was in the past? Where is our energy security likely to go? And we use forecasts for this. And then the third frame of reference is, how does U.S. energy security compare to the energy security of 24 other top energy consuming countries across the globe? So that's my little introductory statement. I'm going to turn it over to Dan now, and he is going to go through in a little bit more detail how we created the index. Dan.
Okay, thank you. I'll go through the presentation, and I was told we'd have time for Q&A at the end, but if I say anything that's incredibly not understandable, interrupt me. This thing work? Next slide, please. We can do that. Or does it have to be pointed toward the laptop? It's got a different one on this screen. The little plastic cover on the back was missing and scotch taped over.
While we're waiting for that,
Your tuition,
I
sure.
do have a question. It goes to your lead-in. Talk about our energy risk and the past and maybe other countries. Did you ever look at it from the standpoint of the energy risk based on the energy dependencies, and we can reduce this risk if we reduce dependencies and the contributing things that might go to then the energy threats to the flows and the threats, rather than historical and inter-organizational or intercultural.
I think the answer to your question is yes. Some things we can measure, some things we can't measure. As we go through the presentation, we'll try to make those distinctions. There's a lot of things we would dearly love to be able to measure that we just can't do. One of them would be like choke points. Can't figure out a way to do that and put it into an index. But there are a lot of other things that we can use as proxies to sort of get to the same sort of thing. And so we'll go into more detail on that. But the short answer is yes.
Okay, our technical problems we believe are resolved. To add to what Steve was saying, when his organization was founded, I think it was done with the idea that energy security is not a Democrat or Republican problem. In fact, as we collect some quotes here over the last several years, you can see basically it's 4 decades plus of it's a problem. So it was founded with the idea that it would be a nonpartisan way of looking and making recommendations, bringing in analytic studies. The original president of it was James Jones, who became Obama's national security advisor, and now it's under the direction of former DOE policy expats. And so as Steve had mentioned, they were coming up with this set of dozens of recommendations. And the question is, what do we mean by energy security? And it was something that seemed both, one, obvious, and second, undefined, like patriotism, apple pie, other things. And so we did some little Googling, what have other people said about energy security? A lot of it was dealing with oil imports from hostile nations, or this is before cybersecurity threats, but grid resiliency and other things. But then when we started Googling it with terms of things, adding on terms like measuring energy security, tracking, or even defining energy security, we came up with almost nothing. And we realized that inadvertently we had stumbled into this undefined world that everyone seems to care about, but no one ever actually has tried to define or quantify.
Just let me add. So in Washington, energy independence has always been a code word for energy security. They use the two terms interchangeably. Yeah, we don't agree that they're the same concept, and it's more than just about oil. As Dan said, in Washington, the proxies for energy security are we energy independent? How much oil do we import? And what's the price of gasoline? That's another big one. And so what we tried to do with the index is take it out of that realm and put it on a more analytical basis and try to cover all the energy sectors involved, not just oil.
So we spent a considerable amount of time looking at what other people have written about energy security, as well as looking through the various recommendations and policy measures we were proposing to try and infer from that, if we think policy A is going to be helpful, what must we be saying is an important role to that? And it began to evolve into different classes of energy security risk. And you can see up there, we have geopolitical risk, which largely relate to oil and gas markets, economic risk, which are both domestic and international, reliability risk in terms of the supply chain and in the electric power sector, capacity reserves, transmission grid resiliency, et cetera, and environmental risk. And if we looked over time, actually environmental risks have, prior to about 50 years ago, were not considered part of those risks. But we think of environmental risk as it relates to energy security in a couple of ways. One, an actual physical change in the climate poses a number of risks to infrastructure, to population migrations and everything. The Defense Department has been on this for quite some time. And two, there's just a policy risk that if you do nothing now and you have to do something later, the longer you wait, the bigger the price tag is going to be. And we found other dimensions in each of the other areas. In the geopolitical, there's the military hard power aspects of it versus the political soft power. Economic, some are just to the U.S., but as we now know, in an interconnected world, economic shocks anywhere can ripple through everywhere. So we began to say, what are the ways we can do this? How can we measure and keep a track on this? And we have, and we'll go through these in short order. There's a U.S. index, which is both a historical part as well as a projected part, using annual energy outlook forecasts that EIA makes. And we have an international index that looks at every country, focuses on the major energy using countries. So we compiled a long list of things we thought were related to energy security and ideas on what might represent a measure of it. That is metrics of components of this. And this was done in parallel with looking at what kind of data exists. That is, in your classic Venn diagram notion, you have this whole sphere of things that you want to be able to measure, and then you have another whole sphere of things of data. And in an ideal world, you get enough overlap that you can actually make meaningful use of some of the data to get to some of what you're trying to measure. Sometimes the overlap isn't there at all. Rare earth minerals you might think of as a critical supply chain. And then you try and figure out how can we measure this in a way where we have data that is both sensible, credible, accessible, updatable, and you find there's just a lot of empty space. Cybersecurity is perhaps another thing that falls into that. But we did find quite a lot of data that we thought helpfully reflected on pieces of the whole energy security picture. And then we say, okay, well, we have these, and if we look over here on the right-hand side, we have 37 different metrics. Some relate to global fuels, oil, gas, and coal production on the global thing, on a global basis. Some are specific to the US, fuel import metrics, energy expenditures, are important because when you have high price energy, as we've seen over times when we have oil shocks, it creates a form of energy poverty. And in particular, the disposable income for lower income Americans goes down quite a lot. That has almost inevitably led to bad things happening. But we also have environmental metrics and for academic crowds, research and development metrics. How much are we spending on industrial R&D on energy, or federal R&D, or what is our status in this country on science and math education? So we were able to come up with what we thought were meaningful metrics for each of those that go back to about 1970, which is before energy became a thing in our conscious. These 37 metrics map onto 4 sub-indexes: geopolitical, economic, reliability, and environmental. And those in turn roll up into what we call the overall index of energy security risk.
Just want to comment on the metrics that we use. Some of these metrics the U.S. has no control over, or very little control over. So when you look at the global fuel metrics, there's really not a whole lot we can do about that. World refining metrics. So there's some metrics in here that really the U.S. has no control over, but most of them, probably probably 3/4 of them we do. So in some sense, we're at the mercy of things that are beyond our control.
And when we get to the international index, you'll see that many of the metrics that affect the U.S. affect the rest of the world. So they don't all go in lockstep, but the general trends of years of good security and years of bad security tend to coincide. So this is the most recent numbers. And if we look, we can actually attach labels to a number of them. You can see it's like a golf score. Big numbers are bad, low numbers are good. We picked 1980. We define that index to be 100, and everything is calibrated relative to that, because 1980 was a particularly crappy year for a lot of things, but the energy being one of them. And we said, okay, if we get close to 100, we know things are getting bad. So you can see the first Arab oil embargo kind of pushed you up quite a bit, but that was relatively short-lived and faded for a couple of years, and we went there. Then we go through a long period through the Reagan years of low oil prices and a boring energy scene, which is good for a risk perspective. But beginning in the late 90s and through the last decade, started climbing again. You had oil, you had gas prices in California, the Enron thing. A lot of that was going on, and then oil prices started climbing again, peaking at about 2008, 2009, which is about the time we were beginning our work here. So part of the origin story, I guess, of Steve's organization is it was founded at a time of maximum freakout on energy security. But what we've seen is in the years since then, it's come down quite a bit. And when you look out, this looks like a very boring future. It's a low level of risk. And you say, well, why are we even here today? Problem solved, let's go home.
So you say 70% is a low level of risk?
Well, historically, the lowest we've seen
It's about 75.
since 1970 was around there.
These are not percentages. These are scores.
Yeah.
Okay. So historically, it fluctuates between about a 101 score to about a 75 score. So anytime you're near 100, bad things are happening or about to happen. And when you get down to below 80, you're actually doing really well. I mean, Dan showed the first slide, the presidential statement. Just a little interesting factoid was, great place to go for presidential statements on energy and energy security is State of the Union addresses. And I went through every State of the Union address from Bill Clinton. I found 3 sentences on energy. And when you look at where our low energy scores are, when Bill Clinton was president, energy wasn't an issue, wasn't a political issue. It was well before that, and it was after that. So that's kind of an indication that we think that we've got this right.
So if we look at the forecast aspect of the previous year's editions, and we've done about 8 or 9 of these now, we can see that when we did the first one, right after the crash in 2008 and nothing was happening, but the forecast was oil prices would be high again. We'd be back basically looking at a couple of decades of a world of hurt. And it was pretty frightening time for that. But then in the next year, it was a little bit lower, and then almost each year it would drop out a bit. So what we see now as boring is really very recent in our thinking. And when we look at the forecast part, let me make a distinction. At any given time, the forecast we use, that is EIA's Annual Energy Outlook, incorporates basically their best thinking about the way the future is going to evolve. So it includes improvements in some technologies, some energy efficiencies, and other aspects. It includes population growth and all, and incorporates all of that, and that feeds right into our model. So if each year it looks exactly the same as they had projected previously, that would not show up as a change in our forecast. It would be as, we had our forecast last year and it still looks good. So a lowering of the risk levels as seen in these forecasts actually indicates a change in the way we think about the future. And this is a pretty profound amount of change. And there are a number of factors, but there's one factor that in our research kind of has dominated on, which was not foreseen when we started this 10 years ago. Any clues? Yeah. It's not that we were big shale advocates per se, or that we knew it was coming, but that has changed not only our energy picture, but the risk aspects of our energy picture more than almost anything. So these few graphs, the red line is what the forecast looked like in 2008. And the blue line is what it looks like now. So crude oil production, which was flat and slowly declining, we thought 10 years ago, has hit record highs and is still rising. Same with natural gas production. And when you take into account our domestic production along with some greater efficiencies on the consumption side, we can back out what net imports are going to be. And so net imports at that time, which were rising and thought to be rising forever, been declining. And natural gas, we're now in an export situation. For some of our metrics, that has, the import itself is a metric, but also the money we spend on that. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year, which we're going overseas, remain within our domestic economy. In terms of the security, who were the previous recipients of those hundreds of billions of dollars? Often countries that don't like us.
Just a couple of things, Dan. Okay. Go back. So the forecast for U.S. crude oil production, the record from 1970, U.S. record was 9.6 million barrels a day. And EIA is now forecasting that we'll be producing anywhere from 11 to 12 million barrels a day every year out to 2050. It's something that comes along once every 50 years in the oil and gas industry. And with natural gas production, we're looking at an increase every year out to 2050. And the reason this is significant is because even when the shale gale started to blow hard around 2010, 2011, EIA was still predicting that shale production of oil and gas would peak sometime in the middle 2020s and then start to decline afterwards. The view now is that it's not going to peak in 2020. It's going to keep rising, and it's going to stay high all the way out to 2050. And this is, as Dan said, this has a ripple effect. It has a ripple effect in our import metrics, has a ripple effect in our expenditure metrics, but also things like the retail electricity prices. Whereas we once anticipated that they were going to be rising at a rapid rate, retail electricity prices are now going to be pretty flat. And it ripples through the environmental metrics as we're burning more gas instead of coal in the power sector. So we can't overemphasize how the shale revolution has really changed a broad suite of our metrics in the index.
Mm-hmm. On the geopolitical aspect, just think for a moment. For decades, I'll take current headlines. Saudi Arabia has been our friend and ally for decades. If they did not have that oil, or we did not need that oil, would they have been in that special status? And so the shale aspects changes both the political, the hard and soft powers of the geopolitical aspect. If we look at this, we see that natural gas imports, which beginning about the mid-'80s were climbing and at a rate of climb that looked dangerously like what we were experiencing with oil in the 1970s. That was projected to keep climbing pretty much forever. Now we're a net exporter. Petroleum net imports, probably sometime in the next 10 years, we'll be a net exporter. This is both crude and products together. And then on the bottom two, it looks at the dollars that go to that. We were spending over $500 billion a year at our peak for importing mostly oil into the country. That's money some of it comes back to the U.S. economy, but a lot of it goes into other places. When that's done at home, that has a tremendous economic effect.
Needless to say, when we started this index, we never expected to see any metrics go to zero.
Yeah.
And before 2030, we're going to have 4 metrics that will go to zero.
And again, with the idea that the changes in the outlook reflect changes in expectations. EI knew about shale for quite a while, but the current thinking theirs as well as probably most of the world, was that it was limited to certain circumstances. There was a maximum amount you could get per frac. The depletion rates would be, at a certain rate. It would perhaps put a brake on some of the import dependency, but would never really dominate conventional production. And each year, though, what they've seen is productivity has gone up, production has gone up more than expectations, and that's what's changed this.
I had a question about the lens that you put on this. Seems to be U.S. Have you also looked at it from a continental lens, meaning North American energy independence? Is that a better way to look at it? Because I don't think the Canadians are going to cut us off anytime soon. Should we be bringing that into our thinking?
You're the second person that's asked us about a continental index. We haven't been able to do it because it's difficult to match up the data sets that are available. But when we talk about the international index, we'll bring in some of those issues.
But I will add that the expenditure things are just U.S. as well as the imports are just U.S. But when we look at imports and world production, we developed a large data set of production by country from 1970 on. Then we take that data set and apply 2 things to it. One is the diversity index, HHI index, if you're into the weeds on this, where it's, the question is, it's a global market, particularly for petroleum. So even if Canada wants to show us off, there are lots of other places that do. So how many countries have control of how big a fraction of production is one of the factors. And the other, we weighted by Freedom House Freedom Index, political and economic freedom. The going assumption being that countries that don't have political and economic freedom pose a higher risk to the world order than those that do. So those affect the U.S. and Canada. The U.S. and Canada are just 2 of the countries that fold into those calculations.
So to the extent that the U.S. increases its production, it lowers the overall global fuel risk because we're reliable and we contribute to diversity.
Yeah.
One thing we didn't do, though, so what we didn't do was measure where we get our imports from. What we did was measure how much we import as a share of our consumption, and then attached a risk to the global pool, because you can get your energy from anywhere, right? So we didn't focus on where we got it from. We focused on what was the risk attached to the global pool.
Yeah.
So the risk is really just of the ability to acquire.
Yes.
Right. So we essentially weight production
As opposed to the risk of the energy system on climate and desertification and henceforth conflicts like in Syria and other places, and how that creates a broader world of
Mhm.
risk that the energy part contributed to.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's
And
fair.
we'd love to be able to do that. This falls in the category of things you want to measure, and then how do you get data that works over a period of time. The amount, or related to that, the amount of oil that passes through 4 or 5 major choke points on the world's oceans is a very high fraction.
I'm talking about civil unrest around the world
Yeah.
because the climate is changing, and that's causing deserts in North Africa
Yes.
and the Middle East, and that's causing the escape of certain people from Syria and other places into
Mhm.
Europe, which is causing political issues in Europe, and that is a
I would-
societal risk. That
Mhm.
Yeah, I would push.
triggers from the energy
Yeah.
being burned to
Yes.
create the climate.
I would push back a little bit on that. If you look at where most of the refugees in the world come from, they come from countries that have limited energy access. They're energy poor countries. So energy is actually a solution to a lot. When you look at California, California had a pretty bad drought for about 5 years, but there wasn't political unrest there because the average Californian uses about 5 or 6 times more than the average Syrian and about 20 times more than the average Nigerian, for example.
I
So-
think the gentleman's point, though, not just on energy consumption,
Right.
but the effects of climate change. That is,
Yeah,
if sea level in Bangladesh rises 2 feet, how many tens of millions of people are displaced? Or drought in Syria, or any of those other aspects. And yeah, a lot of our actual early thinking that led us to say, CO2 measures and energy efficiency measures are a major part of this index, stemmed from Department of Defense analyses.
but that's why we measure the political and civil liberties
Yeah.
too. So countries that have a high degree of political and civil liberties are better able to manage those risks than countries that don't.
So this chart also does a comparison of what we saw the first time we did this. It looked like our total energy demand. So this is not just oil, but also gas and coal. Quarter of our energy at that point, which was close to a high point, was projected to continue as year after year of that kind of counting on the rest of the world to feed our appetites. And what we see now is that has steadily declined, and we're moving toward a place where we will be an exporter of energy to the world.
Question about like utilities and renewable energy, because that's a new the demand profile on natural gas.
Mm-hmm.
Is that incorporated? Because that was such a surprise and how quickly it's adopted and how cheap like
Yeah. Give me a couple of slides. We'll get to exactly that point, because electric power is my particular focus. We said the big thing that changed it. There are a number of factors, but the big one has been shale, and shale is found in basins all around the planet. And so the question, why is the U.S. kind of almost alone in being able to develop this resource to the extent we have? This goes back to a lot of just one of the entrepreneurial culture. It goes back to property rights and ownership, infrastructure. For a new technology coming on the scene, I think the U.S. happened to be particularly well poised to take advantage of it. Also driving it was perhaps on the demand side, freaking out over the amount of energy, for the oil producers. The next country and basin they have to go to and around the world, and the kind of risk they did. All of those came together to make the U.S. a fertile place for this kind of development. So as a result, again, totally unthinkable years ago, oil and natural gas production were number one. Coal production has actually fallen about 25 or 30%, primarily because the electric power sectors switch. But we're still number two. China's way out. They are trying to cut back. But nuclear power, wind power, solar power, also major areas of growth in the U.S. All this extra supply has created some price competitive advantages for the U.S. Oil is a global commodity. We pay for oil about what everyone else pays for it. But natural gas has become much cheaper here than other countries, to the point where building an LNG terminal, liquefying it, shipping it around the world, degasifying, looks to be an economic proposition. It's lowered electricity prices for industry and for some of your particularly energy intensive industries, cement, steel, and so on. This has become a major draw. Chemical plants that would have located in Europe are now looking at sites in the U.S.
You probably can't see the countries, but these are OECD countries, so these data come from the Energy Information Administration. But I used to show those charts to my colleagues in Europe, and they would always break out to a sweat.
Yeah. So it's not just a production aspect on energy, although the change in the shale technologies has changed our expectation. We've been on a long ride toward improved energy efficiency, and these are a couple of different measures. Energy intensity is measured as the amount of BTU per dollar of GDP, and then we can come up with similar type measures on household energy efficiency, commercial. Industrial has actually shown the biggest. It's more than twice as efficient as it was when we started looking at this in 1970. Household energy, less so, because there are a couple of things. Even though we have a lot more efficient technologies from things like the Energy Star program, and our flat screen TVs use less energy than the old CRTs, we have a lot more gadgets. Houses are bigger. And for some of us like me, I work out of my home these days. So I'm actually substituting more household energy for what used to be transportation energy. And that shows up in the transportation metrics. Transportation energy per dollar of GDP, which used to be pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio, has been declining steadily since about the mid-90s, which perhaps coincidentally is about when Amazon started shipping things. The electric power sector, we look at the black line you see here are CO2 emissions. And what we see is that they have been climbing for years and years and years. Electricity was grabbing a bigger share of the overall energy picture. We're building a lot of coal plants, nuclear plants, everything. But normally upward forces, growth in GDP and a growth in population in and of themselves are upward forces on the amount of electricity we use and the amount of carbon emissions we would have. Offsetting that, not necessarily all the time, but conceivably offsetting that is a change in electricity intensity. And that's both on the generation side as combined cycle plants with their greater efficiency displace old legacy steam plant, and particularly the carbon intensity. As you can see here, from 70s up until, there wasn't that much change in the overall carbon intensity. This is pounds of carbon per kilowatt hour generated. Sometimes you'd have nukes come in, sometimes you'd have gas and everything. But around 10 years ago, this really began accelerating. That's when natural gas started backing out coal in the power sector. And then the last few years, in addition to the natural gas, renewables, first wind and now solar, are coming in. So overall, in the electric power sector, since 2005, carbon emissions have been reduced over 600 million metric tons per year. By contrast, if you look at any other country over that time period or any other time period, no other country has ever done as much as 200 million tons of reduction. So the U.S. electric power sector is at least triple what any other country has ever done.
So I need to do the thing. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so someone asked about renewables. So this is the chart on the left is the EIA AEO 2018 projection, and it's annual changes in generating capacity. What's a couple of things are interesting about this chart. The yellow is solar, and after the investment tax credit expires, you see a couple of years before 2025, you see solar capacity additions starting to shrink, but then they pick up, and they average about 8 to 12 gigawatts every year out to 2040 at least. But wind is the interesting thing. So wind is the gray bar, and after the PTC expires for wind, pretty much no wind being built after that. And so at least EIA believes, and I know the wind guys don't believe this, but EIA believes that wind is much more sensitive to a subsidy than solar is, obviously. And you also see coal plants closing. And so this is the share, and really what you're seeing out to 2040 is that solar is replacing coal, and everybody else, all the other technologies kind of stay the same throughout the period. So what we're really looking at is solar displacing coal. We can go next one. Oh, so I'll do the international.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just passed this slide if you want.
No, it's right there.
Oh, okay. You have that.
Yeah. So we said the third frame of reference was how do we compare to other countries? And we had to make some compromises when we did the international index because let's face it, the United States is a data-rich environment. We had enough data here to do 37 metrics. We couldn't do 37 metrics internationally, so we settled on 29. There's no R&D metrics anywhere because we couldn't find the data. Instead of going back to 1970, we started 1980. And what we did was focus on the top 25 large energy consuming countries in the world, and they account for about 80% of global demand. No forecast component that we use. And what we did was establish an OECD baseline for comparison. You have to establish some baseline. You can use just about whatever you want. We thought an OECD baseline would be kind of representative of where big modern economies are. And so I'm not going to go into any great detail on what we did, but here are the results for our recent rankings. So remember, this is like the golf score. Norway is number 1. They have the lowest rank by far. The United States actually is number 2. Wasn't all that long ago the United States ranked 9 in our list, but now it ranks number 2. And poor Ukraine down here at the bottom. Whoops. And poor Ukraine is down at the bottom and has been for a while. There's Ukraine right there, the risk score for Ukraine going back to 1992. But you can see there's a general sort of soft U-shaped pattern of risks that a lot of countries have displayed, with some exceptions. And what we do is the OECD baseline, you can see there in black, what we do is we compare how other countries score against the OECD baseline. And we'll show it a little bit.
So on that last chart, though, an important element is when we done the U.S., we saw that the 1980s looked like a lower risk. It's improper to think that that's because we're doing anything special. We just got a free ride on the same bus that everyone else was riding on.
And so I mentioned Ukraine. Here's another interesting. This is China. Here, China's risks were tremendously high at around 1980, and it's since progressively gotten much more efficient. Efficiency plays a big part in this. And its risks have declined, but they are beginning to inch up over the past decade or so. So we have seen tremendous shifts and moves in the index scores for a lot of these countries. So the U.S. is improving against its peers. What we did was we took the difference in risk score between the United States and the OECD average. And for most of the periods since 1980 through about 2005, the U.S. chugged along at between 5 and 10%, a score of 5 to 10% higher than the OECD average. And then you can see here where the shale revolution starts to kick in, and U.S. scores have declined relative to the OECD score.
So an important point on this is that
decade,
there are things that affect each country, and the country having a higher or lower risk in general doesn't signify badness. Canada has a cold climate. Cities are spread out. There's not a lot they can do about it. Europe and Japan are more compact. So there are inherent factors there. Well, what we see on this is that there are things that can be country specific, either in terms of technologies or policies that can move the needle of one country vis-a-vis the others. In this case, the U.S. has developed the shale resources to an extent no one else has had. And as we saw earlier, that is factored through not only into our import dependency, but our energy expenditures, our electric power mix, our CO2 emissions, and so on. All of those are somewhat unique to the U.S.
Yeah, so this is a chart of different types of energy security challenges. What we did essentially was break up, we have our 8 categories of risks, metrics. We have environmental metrics, transportation sector. It's very, it's a busy slide, and I apologize, but I do want to just point out a couple of interesting things here. So these are how much these categories contribute to the risk score. And I took the Australian, Canada, US average. These countries have a lot of things in common. I took the Western European average, and I took the developing country average. And you can see they have different challenges. And I'm just going to focus on one. Fuel imports in the red here. You can see Australia, Canada, US. Fuel imports contribute a very, very small amount to the overall risk for those countries. And when you go over to Western Europe, that red is pretty wide. Europeans have a big problem with the imports, but they use energy a lot more efficiently, and it explains a lot of what's going on in Europe. And you can see here, the blue here is energy use. It contributes much more to the risk in Australia, Canada, US compared to Europe. So it's how they respond to different circumstances. And developing countries, looking at the fuel imports, you can see where these countries really started to take off economically around the mid-1990s. And at that point, their fuel import risks really started to expand and contribute more to the overall risk. So I'm not going to go into any detail on the other ones, but this is just to show that there are different types of energy security challenges that countries face. So the takeaways from the international index are energy security risks are linked in the global energy markets. Improvements everywhere, anywhere, cause improvements everywhere, and disruptions anywhere can affect markets everywhere. Just because you have a large resource base, does that mean you're going to get a great ranking? If you have a large resource base and you're energy efficient, you'll get a good ranking like Norway and the UK. People are very surprised that Russia does not score well on this. Russia has the second largest energy resource in the world, only behind the United States. And yet it scores in the mid-table in our index. And the reason it does that is because it doesn't use energy very efficiently at all. And its environmental metrics also don't score very well. So even though it has a large resource base, it uses energy inefficiently, and therefore it gets a fairly poor ranking. And actually, we do numbers for all the countries, and you'd be surprised, countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, they don't score very well on this either, again, for the same reason. They don't use energy as efficiently as some of the other countries. Energy security is affected by factors that countries have control over and some that they don't. Dan mentioned Canada's cold climate, which contributes to its relatively high energy per capita and intensity metrics. Really not much Canada can do about climate. Resources are not enough without proper investment. I showed you the slide where the US, I can go back to it, where the US is dipping compared to the OECD average. Mexico is going in the opposite direction, starting down here at a low level, and it's rising against the OECD level. Same thing with Indonesia. It started a little above the OECD average, and it's just going up and up and up. And one of the reasons for that is because it has a poor investment environment. And I think we all know about the change to the Constitution in Mexico. We think that that's a good indication that they're getting serious about changing their investment environment. And Indonesia is doing some things as well. And I'll get to this point, this point later. And new technologies, as Dan said, can have a positive and disruptive force. Hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, advanced seismic images. These are the technologies that have been applied that have unleashed the shale revolution here in the United States. And my last slide, Dan doesn't like this slide, I like it. So I mentioned we run this for every country in our database. It's a huge database. We do our report and we focus on the top 25 energy consuming countries, but we do run the numbers for other countries. And when you rank them, this is the ranking that you get. It's kind of an interesting mix of countries. These are the 10 countries in the world with the lowest index scores in our index. You got Gabon, you got Chad, you got North Korea, you have Denmark. And I was looking at this chart one day and I said, geez, it's kind of a weird mix of countries. And it dawned on me that countries like Chad score well in the index because they don't use energy. And if you don't use energy, your energy risks are very, very low. And so what we've seen, and when you take a close look at the data, what you see is that when countries start developing and start using more and more energy, some of the underlying risks that energy risks that may not be apparent start to reveal themselves, and your risk scores start getting higher and higher rather than lower and lower. This is something a lot of countries have gone through. But it's also put in context that we're talking about energy security risks here, but there are other risks. There are poverty risks, and the risks associated with people not having access to energy. So all of these are trade-offs. And if you ask these countries whether they would trade having a low energy security risk score or having 100% of the people with access to electricity, I would guess they would say 100% of the people with access to electricity. So we just want to put this in context, that we're focused on the security risks, but there are other risks that energy can help solve. And I think that's it, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. So we're ready for questions. Who's first? Steve?
I'll just make the comment that my early comments are trying to get at the point of the demand, i.e. North Korea and Chad didn't have demand. Therefore, you don't need a resource if you don't have a use. And the risk is the matter of having enough resource to meet the use. Taking that one step further, if you can get your population to be focused on efficiency, i.e. super insulating houses, having a car, you power off your own roof, those things, you get rid of demand for externally measured and vended electricity, which is what you're measuring. You're not measuring what I get off my wrist and run my Tesla Model X. Okay. And so resilience is a thing which reflects a focus toward avoiding the risk. And I'd like to hear, if you think about your talk going forward, getting resilience in there and getting that balance of need, perceived need, and need that satisfies all your real needs, and an externalized source, which then gets into the export.
I would, by way of agreeing with you, I would say a lot of the energy efficiency measures are a measure of resilience. An interesting thing that when we dig deep down in the weeds, we look at Japan, which is a country that has no indigenous fossil fuels resources to speak of. They import almost everything. As a country, they've compensated by being super efficient and such. And so, interestingly, when the oil price spiked about 10 years ago, England got hit worse than Japan. England is a net exporter, but they pay the same price as everyone else in the world does. They use a lot more of it than Japan. And so these things show up. I mean, there are different ways of getting at it, but we try and show the things we can show in a way that we can track over time. But the efficiency part is a big part of it. Similarly, there is a metric in there for the electric power sector on non-carbon generation resources, not just renewables, but also hydro and nuclear. The sense being there that kind of diversity in your generation mix has it improves your reliability, makes you less vulnerable to a single disruption.
I'll just mention a member of the House of Representatives from Rhode Island, a Republican lady, Schneider, in the 80 to 90, she had 5 terms. She introduced the Energy Star program, which
I know it well.
Talk coming out of the White House recently has been get rid of Energy Star, but that was toward efficiency. She now lives in Boulder, and she says the best thing from a climate standpoint for this upcoming election is for everybody. She's a Republican, but she says every Republican needs to vote blue. because the current Congress will not solve that problem with this configuration. I'll just throw that.
Steve and I have an agreement not to talk politics with each other. But you're right. The energy efficiency program not only works here, but in a global market, the U.S. ought to be at least be promoting, if not supplying, other countries, because reducing, a more efficient light in a European country has some of the same effects on us as doing it ourselves. And these are export markets. Auto mileage efficiency standards also fall neatly within the point you just made.
Yes, sir.
So your metrics showed the United Kingdom as being the third most risk averse, I guess. However, they got a big dependency upon renewables, part of the wind, big dependency upon their imports as far as gas. So how does that make them stable? They don't have a very big mix. They're policy adverse to fracking, developing their own fossil fuel there. And now Brexit may affect the trade agreements that impact a lot of that import. Why is your risk score so low right now? Because Brexit wasn't a factor in this? Or?
Brexit would not play into this. I mean, the effects of Brexit on energy markets might, but I mean, Brexit itself wouldn't. But the UK uses energy very efficiently. Like I said, its emissions are quite low. Its import risks are much lower than the average. So it's one of these countries that does well on a number of different things. Doesn't do great on really any of them, but does good enough on a lot of them that it gets a third place score. We do see some clouds on the horizon. There have been concerns about the power sector in the UK. They have one of the highest retail electricity rates in the world. But to your point about shale, my understanding is they actually are. One firm does have permission now to go forward and start fracking wells. And we'll have to see how that turns out. Obviously, there's been a lot of public opposition to that. But it seems there's a lot of shale gas available in the UK. And my view is if that one country can kind of prove the concept, then it might become more widespread in Europe. I mean, they have a lot of problems in Europe. The geology is different. They have dense populations. If you own the property, you don't own mineral rights. So there's the question of how do you get the local communities where all the drilling is going to be taking place? How do you get them to see an advantage to that, to allowing that to happen? So I think when it comes to shale in Europe, they have a lot of things that they have to sort out before it becomes anywhere nearly as big as in the United States.
I'll just add one comment to the shale thing, because we've talked quite a bit about it, and it sounds like we're shale boosters per se. And let me put my environmentalist hat on, because that's where most of my work has been done. There's a certain skepticism with shale. Certainly there are the ancillary effects of shale development on communities, the methane emissions, possible seismicity, groundwater usage, wastewater disposal, et cetera. But when I look at the CO2, which is my particular thing, the numbers are pretty stark. There's never been anything that has reduced CO2 emissions as quickly and as deeply as shale development as natural gas and what that's done to the electric power sector. Now, I mentioned there are these other issues with it. And so the policy question that stems from that is, are these benefits so great that we ignore these ancillary impacts? Or conversely, are these ancillary impacts so great that we trash the technology? Or is there a middle way? Are the problems that are sometimes associated with shale development so unfixable and so unmanageable that we either live with it or not? Or if they are fixable, what does that entail? And we happen to be in a state that probably has done more than any other state in trying to address some of those issues on methane emissions and such. I would hope personally that more of the developers would take a view of the long term, not try to basically kill the goose that lays the golden eggs by getting what they can as fast as they can. So,
Andrew, you want to
that's a policy discussion.
I was just gonna ask, you did a lot of evaluation of U.S. and the rest of the world, but have you found any upcoming headwinds that could change some of the scoring here in the next decade?
With the rest of the world? Or the U.S.?
Yeah.
Well, if you see our forecast, it's pretty flat. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, that's because that's the way forecasts are. I mean, anybody who's looked at the price of crude oil like this until you get to the forecast, and it's nice and smooth. Right, yeah. So there's always those sorts of things. And there's some things we can't measure. I mean, what we do for the global fuel metrics, the 6 global fuel metrics covering oil, gas, and coal production reserves, we don't have a forecast component for that. And that's where a lot of bad things could happen. So we just essentially flatline that out into the future because we'd have no other way of guessing. We're not political prognosticators, and it's very difficult to come up with a scenario where something bad could happen. We know something bad is going to happen. So what's, from our perspective, the good news is that our risk is very, very low. So when something bad does happen, and something bad will happen, we're in a much better position to be able to deal with it than if our risk scores are a lot higher. So we're in a better place than we were 10 years ago, looking to the future. But you're right, anything, and lots of bad stuff can happen.
Just to add quickly, though, things to keep an eye on and think about in terms of the energy security domestically. If efforts to undo progress in shale technologies takes place, that will be a big factor in the same way that it's contributed to a lower energy risk. Its undoing would contribute to a higher energy risk. Undoing auto efficiency standards. That's been a measurable effect between last year and this year in our forecast. And then internationally, it feels, at least to me, that we're into a period of increasing instability. And where that goes, anyone's guess.
On that bright note.
We're doomed, so deal with it.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gift. Thanks for sharing your time with us. Pleasure. A little bit of TV sweat.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks, gentlemen. I guess there was one last hand, but I think you might grab you after we're done. So. All right.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I'll share with you, and I'm sorry, I only got one left in my wallet. But I'd like to encourage you. I have the only carbon negative engine in the world. It's also